The greatest question in the Bible is this: what will you do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?
He once stood beside a presidential candidate on a stage in Texas. Within months, that same candidate rejected him in public, calling his words deeply offensive and indefensible. That is the story of a man who built one of the largest churches in America, and it is a story that keeps circling back on itself, decade after decade, because the same old sermons keep resurfacing at the worst possible moments. This is the story of Pastor John Hagee, a preacher who has spent more than 60 years being praised as a defender of Israel and condemned as something far more troubling, sometimes in the very same week. John Charles Hagee was born on April 12, 1940, in Goose Creek, Texas, a refinery town later absorbed into Baytown, just outside Houston. He was the second of 4 sons born to Reverend William Bethel Hagee and Veda Mildred Swick Hagee, and he came from a family with generations of preachers behind it. His father ran small Assemblies of God congregations around the Houston area, and music filled the household as much as scripture did. The family had no television, so evenings were spent gathered around a piano, and young John, known as Johnny, played saxophone in his father's services almost as soon as he could hold one. He grew up torn between 2 very different paths. At Reagan High School in Houston, he became a National Honor Society student and a 4-sport letterman, eventually earning a commission to West Point. By every measure, a military career was in front of him. Then, at 17, everything changed. During a revival service, he felt what he later described as an overwhelming call to ministry, and instead of heading to the academy, he walked away from it entirely. In March of 1958, just before turning 18, he preached his first sermon and, in his own words, never looked back. He enrolled at Southwestern Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie, Texas, working through Bible college while preaching at small revivals on weekends to make ends meet. From there, his academic path kept expanding rather than narrowing. He later earned a second bachelor's degree in history and education from Trinity University in San Antonio in 1964, playing football there on a scholarship. He briefly coached at a middle school, winning district titles in multiple sports, before going back to school again. In 1966, he completed a master's degree in educational administration from the University of North Texas. That combination, seminary training plus formal graduate education, set him apart from many preachers of his generation and would shape how he later ran a sprawling media and ministry operation. Also in 1966, at just 26, Hagee founded Trinity Church in San Antonio, his first congregation of his own. It grew steadily for nearly a decade. Then, in 1975, his life took a sharp and painful turn. Hagee sent a letter to his congregation admitting to what he called immorality, and shortly afterward he divorced his first wife, Martha Downing, whom he had married in 1960 and with whom he had 2 children. The fallout from that admission led him to resign from the church he had built. Rather than fade from ministry, though, he started over almost immediately. On Mother's Day, May 11, 1975, he took over a struggling congregation of about 25 people in Castle Hills, a San Antonio suburb, and renamed it the Church at Castle Hills. A year later, in 1976, he married Diana Castro, a member of that small congregation, and the two have remained married ever since, raising 3 more children together. What followed was a genuinely remarkable institutional rise. The Castle Hills congregation outgrew its space within 2 years and kept expanding through the late 1970s and 1980s. On October 4, 1987, Hagee dedicated a new sanctuary seating more than 5,000 people and gave it the name it carries today, Cornerstone Church. Over the following decades, Cornerstone grew into a megachurch claiming more than 20,000 active members, making it one of the largest religious institutions in Texas. Alongside the church, Hagee built Global Evangelism Television and John Hagee Ministries, broadcasting his sermons across dozens of television networks and reaching, by his ministry's own estimates, well over 100 million households worldwide. He also became a prolific author, with somewhere between 30 and 45 books to his name depending on the count, several of them landing on the New York Times bestseller list, including 4 Blood Moons and Jerusalem Countdown. In 2011 he even released a gospel music album, A Lifetime of Music, featuring the Oak Ridge Boys and Bill Gaither, which picked up 2 GMA Dove Award nominations. By any measure, this was a preacher who had turned a single pulpit into a nationwide brand. Financial scrutiny followed that growth. Investigative reporting from the early 2000s, before Hagee restructured part of his nonprofit operations in 2004, found that Global Evangelism Television reported tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue, and that Hage's combined compensation as head of the ministry and as pastor placed him among the highest-paid non-profit executives in the San Antonio area at the time. Estimates of his personal net worth today vary enormously depending on the source, ranging from around $5 or $6 million in some assessments to claims of $50 million in others, a gap that itself became part of the ongoing criticism of his ministry's finances. Much of that criticism centers on his prosperity-focused preaching, in which he has taught, drawing on passages like Deuteronomy 8 verse 18 and Luke 6 verse 38, that giving generously to the ministry opens the door to financial blessing. Supporters have long described this as biblical encouragement toward generosity. Critics, including watchdog groups that track televangelist finances, have argued it functions as a fundraising formula that pressures struggling believers into giving money they can't afford, in hope of a financial breakthrough that isn't guaranteed. The most serious and most persistent controversy of Hage's career, though, has nothing to do with money. It centers on a sermon he gave in the late 1990s, one that would follow him for the rest of his public life. Preaching from Jeremiah 16, a passage that speaks of God sending fishers and then hunters to bring the Jewish people back to their land, Hage told his congregation that Adolf Hitler was one of those hunters, sent by God's permission to drive Jews toward Palestine. In the recording that later surfaced, Hage can be heard saying plainly that Hitler was a hunter, someone who forces people to move, and that the Holocaust happened because it fit into God's plan to bring the Jewish people home to Israel. When that audio became public in May 2008, in the middle of the presidential campaign, it detonated. Senator John McCain, who had accepted Hage's endorsement months earlier specifically because of Hage's strong support for Israel, rejected that endorsement almost immediately, saying he found the remarks deeply offensive and indefensible and that he repudiated them outright. Hage, for his part, insisted his words had been taken out of context and said flatly that suggesting he in any way condoned Hitler or the Holocaust was a distortion of everything he had preached about the Jewish people for decades. Whichever interpretation people accepted, the political damage to the McCain campaign was done within a single news cycle, and the sermon became permanently attached to Hage's public record. That wasn't the only source of tension between Hage and Jewish organizations, which is part of what made the moment so complicated. He has been, by nearly every account, one of the most outspoken Christian supporters of the modern state of Israel in American religious life. He founded Christians United for Israel in 2006, an organization that grew into the largest pro-Israel lobbying group in the country, and he has met with numerous Israeli prime ministers over the decades. In 2018, he was invited to deliver the closing benediction at the opening ceremony for the U.S. Embassy's move to Jerusalem, a high-profile honor for any religious figure. Yet his theology also holds that Jewish acceptance of Jesus is tied to the events of the end times, a belief many Jewish commentators find troubling regardless of how supportive he is politically, since it frames Jewish people primarily as characters in a Christian prophetic script rather than as a community to be respected on its own terms. That contradiction, fierce ally on one hand, source of theological offense on the other, has trailed him through nearly every major controversy of his career, and it resurfaced sharply again in November 2023, when Hage was invited to speak at the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C., following the Hamas attacks of October 7. Commentators quickly brought the old Hitler sermon back into the conversation, arguing that his presence undercut the very message the rally was trying to send, while his supporters countered that a longtime and consistent friend of Israel belonged on that stage during a moment of crisis. Hage's history of inflammatory remarks extends well beyond that one sermon. He spent years describing the Catholic Church using harsh language that many Catholics considered deeply offensive, and in 2008, under mounting political pressure during the McCain controversy, he sent a letter to the Catholic League expressing regret for comments Catholics had found hurtful. The League publicly accepted the apology and considered the matter closed, though Hage maintained that some of his earlier remarks had been mischaracterized. His comments about Islam drew similar backlash. In a widely discussed 2006 interview with Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air, Hage argued that those who live by the Quran have what he called a scriptural mandate to kill Christians and Jews, a claim that treats an entire global religion as inherently violent rather than distinguishing between extremist interpretations and the beliefs of the vast majority of Muslims worldwide. Critics across the political spectrum labeled the remark straightforwardly Islamophobic. That same NPR interview produced the second most famous controversy of his career. Asked about Hurricane Katrina, which had struck the Gulf Coast the year before and killed more than 1,200 people, Hage said he believed the storm was, in his words, the judgment of God against the city of New Orleans, pointing specifically to a gay pride event that had been scheduled for around the time the hurricane hit. When the remark drew intense criticism, Hage later issued a statement saying that while he believed God's hand is present in everything, He could not actually know the mind of God regarding a specific disaster and should not have suggested otherwise. Still, the original comment, delivered at a moment when survivors were still displaced and grieving, became one of the most cited examples of his tendency to attach cosmic, moralized explanations to real human tragedy. He did something similar in 2014, suggesting that the Ebola outbreak that year carried a spiritual warning tied to American policy toward Jerusalem, and later that same year he described President Obama as one of the most anti-Semitic presidents in American history, a remark the Anti-Defamation League publicly called offensive and misplaced. Hagee later said he had meant to describe Obama's Middle East policy as anti-Israel rather than anti-Semitic, but by then the original comment had already spread widely. His political entanglements have continued into more recent years as well. In November 2021, Cornerstone Church hosted a stop on the Reawaken America tour, a hard-right political and media event featuring speakers including Michael Flynn. Footage from inside the church showed the crowd chanting a coded insult aimed at President Biden, amplified through the church's own sound system, which prompted a watchdog organization to formally ask the IRS to examine whether the event crossed lines that apply to tax-exempt religious institutions. It was one more example of how thoroughly Hagee's ministry has intertwined itself with partisan politics over the decades, going back to his endorsements of presidential candidates from George Wallace in 1968 through Donald Trump in 2016 and beyond. Age and health have become an increasingly visible part of the story in recent years. In October 2020, Hagee's son, Matt Hagee, told the Cornerstone congregation that his 80-year-old father had tested positive for COVID-19 after the virus was detected early, and reports from that period indicated Hagee spent roughly 2 weeks receiving hospital-level care before returning to the pulpit in mid-November of that year. By the mid-2020s, coverage of Hagee described a man in his mid-80s continuing to preach regularly despite reported heart-related health issues and the physical toll of decades spent traveling and speaking. Alongside that, Cornerstone Church has been moving through a gradual, publicly visible succession, with Matt Hagee increasingly taking on the role of lead pastor while his father remains the founding pastor and the public face most closely associated with the ministry's history and reputation. Taken together, it is a career defined by an unusual and uncomfortable pairing. On one side sits genuine institutional achievement, a church built from 25 members into a congregation of 20,000, a media ministry reaching households across the globe, a stack of best-selling books, and a lobbying organization that reshaped how millions of evangelical Christians think about Israel. On the other side sits a decades-long trail of remarks about Jews, Catholics, Muslims, and disaster victims that critics have called, at various points, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, Islamophobic, and simply cruel. Hagee has apologized for some of it, clarified other parts of it, and firmly denied the worst interpretations of still more of it. What hasn't happened is disappearance. Every time his name resurfaces, whether at a rally, in a health scare, or in a fresh round of digging through old broadcasts, the same sermons and the same quotes come back with him, following a man now in his mid-80s who built an empire that even his fiercest critics admit is remarkable, and whose record remains as contested today as it was when a presidential campaign first collided with it back in 2008.